On a spring night in 1536, two men shared a quiet dinner inside the palace, the way they had 1,000 times before. They had grown up together. They had conquered half the world together. One of them was the most powerful ruler on earth. The other was the only person alive he truly called a friend. And by the next morning, one of them was dead, strangled in his sleep, in a room just steps from the Sultan's own, on the orders of the friend he had just dined with. For 13 years, this man had been the second most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire, a boy once sold as a slave who had risen to stand as the Sultan's equal. The Sultan had even sworn a sacred oath never to take his life. And yet, in a single night, that oath was quietly broken, and the empire's greatest vizier vanished into the dark corridors of the palace, his body carried out before the city woke. So how does a man order the death of the person he loves most in the world? What could be so dangerous that not even a sacred oath could protect him? And if that night had gone differently, how much of the history we know might never have happened at all? Stay with me. To understand it, we have to go back to a boy on a fishing boat and a friendship that would build and then break an empire.
He was born around 1493 in a small fishing village on the Greek coast, the son of a fisherman. His whole world was the sea, the nets, and the small rhythms of a poor coastal life. And then, while he was still a child, that world ended. Sea raiders took him, carried him far across the water, and sold him into slavery in the Ottoman lands. Think about that for a moment. A boy, torn from his family, his language, his faith, everything he had ever known, in a single day. By every expectation of his age, that should have been the end of his story, a life swallowed into anonymous servitude. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because even in bondage, something extraordinary happened. He was brought into a household that recognized his mind, and he was given an education most free men of his time could only dream of. He learned languages, Persian, Arabic, and the tongues of the West. He read history and poetry late into the night. He studied maps and the shape of the wider world. And he had a rare gift for music, playing the violin with a skill that drew attention wherever he went. This was not a broken captive waiting to be forgotten. This was one of the most cultured young minds of his generation, quietly taking shape inside a life that was supposed to erase him.
And then came the meeting that would change everything. In the town of Manisa, where Ottoman princes were sent to learn the art of rule, he met a young prince almost exactly his own age. His name was Suleiman. What grew between them was nothing like the bond between a master and a servant. They made music together. They read the same books. They argued about philosophy and the fate of empires deep into the night. The prince did not simply own this young man. He confided in him, trusted him, and in many ways saw in him a mirror of his own restless, brilliant mind. They became, in every sense that mattered, friends. So when that prince ascended the throne as Sultan Suleiman, the man history would call the Magnificent, he did something no Ottoman ruler had ever done. He reached past every seasoned general, every elder, every rule of seniority and rank, and he made his friend the Grand Vizier of the entire empire. A boy who had once been sold in a slave market now stood second only to the most powerful man on earth. He proved worthy of it, too. Sent to Egypt to bring a rebellious province back to order, he rebuilt its administration so effectively that his reforms shaped its governance for generations. He was not merely the Sultan's favorite. He was, very quickly, the empire's most capable statesman.
And Suleiman raised him higher still. He gave his vizier titles, armies, and palaces. Then he tied him into the very heart of the Ottoman ruling elite through marriage, and held a wedding so extravagant the capital had never seen its like. 2 full weeks of feasting at the Hippodrome, in the shadow of Ibrahim's own palace. To the people, it was breathtaking, the celebration of a man who had risen impossibly high. He was no longer only the Grand Vizier. He now stood among the inner circle of the dynasty itself. The intimacy went further than titles. The Sultan would come to his vizier's home simply as a guest, to talk and to share a meal. something no Ottoman ruler had ever done for a servant. The people called him Makbul, the favored one. Foreign ambassadors, struggling to capture his power, simply called him Ibrahim the Magnificent. And to seal it all, Suleiman swore a sacred oath that as long as he lived and reigned, he would never take his friend's life. And on the battlefield, the favorite proved himself again. In 1526, at Mohacs, he commanded the Ottoman army against the Kingdom of Hungary. With a feigned retreat that lured the enemy into a trap, the battle was effectively decided in roughly 2 hours. An entire kingdom's army and its young king destroyed in a single afternoon. He was not just beloved. He was one of the finest commanders the empire ever had.
But his real genius was not on the battlefield. It was at the table, where the fate of nations was decided. He became the architect of Ottoman diplomacy in an age when Europe was tearing itself apart. When the King of France was captured by his great rival, the Habsburg Empire, it was through this vizier that France and the Ottomans drew toward an extraordinary alliance, a partnership between a Christian kingdom and a Muslim empire that would shape the balance of the entire continent for generations. Kings and ambassadors learned that the real power in the empire did not only sit on the throne, it also stood beside it. He led armies to the very gates of Vienna. He negotiated with the great powers of Europe as an equal. He gathered wealth and splendor that rivaled royalty itself. For more than a decade, the Ottoman Golden Age and this one man were almost impossible to separate. He was, in every practical sense, the engine of an empire at the height of its power. And that, though he could not yet see it, was exactly the problem.
Here is the cruel logic of power that he never fully understood. In an empire ruled by one man, the second man owns nothing. His brilliance, his wealth, his armies, none of it is truly his. It is lent to him by the throne, and what the throne lends, the throne can recall. And slowly, almost invisibly, he began to forget this. His confidence hardened into pride. After a campaign in the West, he brought home 3 great bronze statues from a conquered city, figures from Greek myth, and raised them on a pedestal in front of his own palace, in the very heart of the capital. To him, they were art, a sign of his refinement and taste. To the city's holy men, they were something else entirely. A servant of the Sultan, parading graven images in public, was a man who had forgotten what he was. A poet wrote a biting little couplet about 2 men named Abraham, the prophet who once destroyed idols, and this Ibrahim who now raised them up. It spread through the city like fire. The whispers began. And whispers, in that palace, could be deadly.
Then came the mistakes that could not be undone. On a long campaign in the east against the Persian Empire, he clashed with the empire's powerful treasurer, an old mentor who had once helped lift him to power. Their rivalry turned lethal, and the vizier had the older man condemned and executed. But the dead man's accusations did not die with him. With his final words, he swore that the vizier was overreaching, that his ambition now threatened the Sultan himself, and that warning lodged in Suleiman's mind and would not leave. And somewhere in those eastern lands, signing official documents, the vizier gave himself a title that carried a single fatal word: Sultan. To Suleiman, that was not a harmless flourish. It was a shadow falling across his own throne. There was a third force as well, quieter and far more patient. Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, the woman Suleiman loved and would one day marry against all tradition. The vizier's vast power stood directly between her children and the future of the dynasty. Historians still debate how much she shaped what came next, but few doubt that the ground beneath him was steadily shifting toward her. So Suleiman faced an impossible knot. His dearest friend had grown too large. The accusations would not fade, and yet he had sworn a sacred oath never to take this man's life. According to tradition, he found his way out through a religious ruling, a fatwa that allowed him to set the vow aside. The promise had been a wall between his friend and death. Now, there was a door in it.
On the night of March 15th, 1536, during the holy month of Ramadan, the vizier was invited to break his fast with the Sultan inside Topkapi Palace, exactly as he had countless times before. They ate together, as friends, and then he was shown to a room to sleep. That night, the palace executioners came for him in the dark. He is said to have fought for his life, but by morning, the second most powerful man in the world was a body, carried out in silence through a back gate. Makbul, the favored one, had become Maktul, the executed. His palace was sealed, his vast fortune seized by the state, and his grave left deliberately unmarked, so that even in death, no trace of his greatness would remain. And here his story stops being only history and turns into a question. What if Suleiman had spared him? What if that night the oath had held?
Follow the dominoes. First, the empire keeps its sharpest mind at the exact moment it faces Europe and Persia at the same time. His diplomacy and his command might have pushed Ottoman power even deeper into European history in the decades that followed. Second, with him alive and strong, the rise of Hurrem's faction meets a real counterweight, and the palace intrigues that later cost the life of Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's gifted heir, might have unfolded very differently, or never at all. And third, the deepest pattern of all. His death taught every future statesman a brutal lesson. In this empire, no amount of brilliance and no amount of love could shield you from the throne. The most talented men learned to be careful, to hide, to survive rather than to shine. How much genius did the empire quietly lose in the centuries that followed because of the message sent on that single night? We will never know. And that is the haunting thing about him. He was the man who proved an empire could be built on friendship, and the man who proved how fragile that friendship became the moment it touched real power. So let me leave the question with you. If you were Suleiman, holding absolute power, hearing the whispers, bound by a sacred oath to the one person you trusted most, would you have broken it? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, stay with us.